Good morning. I'll call to order the regular meeting of our Zoning and Planning Committee. Today is March 3rd, 2016. I'm Lisa Bender. I chair the committee. We have Council Members Reich, Goodman, Council President Johnson, and Council Member Warsami. We are a quorum of the committee. We have 7 items on today's agenda. We will begin with the consent items before returning to the public hearing. And then we do have a couple of items on discussion. So the consent agenda begins at item number 3, which is approving the vacation of an alley for portions of Main Street Northeast and 30th Avenue North, and adopting the staff findings. Item number 4 has been requested to be continued 1 cycle, and that's a rezoning at 1701 44th Avenue North. And item number 5 is passage of an ordinance related to how we do our preservation regulations to simplify the required findings for a certificate of appropriateness. So I will move items 3 and 5. And Council President.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there's a typo on number 3, which I do believe it should be 30th Avenue Northeast, Councilmember, right? Right.
Thank you. So we'll note that correction in the motion.
Chair Bender, I was just informed that the applicant on item number 4 is requesting that we continue that for 2 cycles.
2 seconds.
Thank you. The clerk just let me know that as well. So with that, I'll move items 3 and 5 for approval and move to continue item number 4 for 2 cycles, which I believe is April 7th. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in approval, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And that carries. That brings us to item number 1, which is the Moxie Hotel at 1121 West Lake Street. We'll start with the staff presentation. This item also includes a rezoning, which is item number 7 under discussion. So we'll have the staff presentation about both of those items. I'll note that the public hearing for the rezoning was already concluded at Planning Commission. So the public hearing for today is really focused on the appeals, and staff will go through all of that. Ms. Helene is here.
Good morning, Chair Bender and committee members. The application before you is actually 2 appeals. So we have 1 appeal from a group of neighbors on the decision of the Planning Commission from their February 8th meeting. That appeal relates to a variance for floor area ratio, conditional use permit for height, yard variance on the rear yard, and a loading variance. And then we have another appeal from the applicant on the Planning Commission's decision to deny a front yard setback variance. So I'll just do those concurrently here. I'm also going to touch on the findings for the rezoning a little more briefly than I did at Planning Commission, but because that is one of the items before you today, we'll go through that as well. So the site is outlined here in the dark bold. It's at 1121 West Lake Street and 3005 Emerson Avenue South, so at the corner of Lake and Emerson. The site currently consists of a small commercial building at the corner. It's a 2-story building that has a restaurant and some residential and a large amount of surface parking. You can see here most of the site is dominated by surface parking right now. The site is proposed to be a hotel. It'd be a 6-story hotel with 123 guest rooms. That hotel would be 6 stories along Lake Street and then step down to 5 stories as you go south. They're proposing a limited amount of surface parking on site and then a drop-off zone for valet, and the majority of the parking would be provided through the valet service. The ground floor would include a restaurant and a lobby. Here's just a rendering of the building, so you can see 6 stories on Lake Street stepping down to 5. As far as the rezoning goes, the first finding that we're asked to look at for a rezoning application is consistency with the comprehensive plan. In this case, the property is on Lake Street, which is a commercial corridor as designated in the comprehensive plan. You can see here the orange line here is the commercial corridor designation. The reddish line is the outline of the activity center over at Lake and Hennepin. Outside the activity center, but that does not mean that it's inconsistent with the comprehensive plan here as far as C3A zoning. As you know, the C3A district is our community activity center district. So while that does match up with the land use designation in the comp plan for activity centers, that does not preclude C3A zoning from being located outside of an activity center. And in fact, we do have several instances of that throughout the city, some of which are recent.
Excuse me, Councilmember Goodman has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was involved in, as one of the people trying to make sure that the zoning had to be at least C3A in order to have a hotel. So prior to that change, because of an issue in my own ward, if that change had not been made not 2 months ago, would there be a rezoning required?
No. So there was a text amendment before the committee earlier this year that would have allowed hotels in the C2 district as of right. We changed it to 2 hotel categories. One, hotels less than 50 units, and 150 units or more, or sorry, 20 is the break. So as part of that, staff had recommended that hotels be allowed in C2, but the final language that was adopted by council did not include that. So the rezoning in this case is requested because of the hotel use.
Okay, thank you.
General policies for commercial corridors call for strong and successful commercial and mixed-use areas with a wide range of character and functions to serve the needs of current and future users, preserving the stability and diversity of the city's neighborhoods while allowing for increased density. Policies, again, for corridors call for a mix of uses with active uses on the ground floor and a height of at least 2 stories. The site is also in the study area of the Uptown Small Area Plan, which was adopted in 2008. Here's the current zoning map, which shows again that the site is C2. They're requesting C3A. We have C3A zoning immediately across the street and also along Lake Street where it's outside of the activity center. As far as the language in the Uptown Small Area Plan goes, this area is designated as the urban village, which you're seeing on your screen here in orange. So it's on the south side of Lake Street, which is the southern boundary of that urban village area. The language for well, I'll just touch here. This is also the future land use map in the small area plan, which designates the site as mixed use. Of course, mixed use is consistent with the C3A zoning designation. The small area plan prioritizes streets such as Lake Street as places for social interaction and urban activity. It recognizes that Uptown plays a role as a regional attraction in the local community. It talks about defining the edges of new growth and shaping the edges so that they transition to the neighborhood in a clear and predictable manner. In this case, the hotel is stepping down to 5 stories, and then there's a 17-foot setback between that 5th story and the south property line where it transitions to the neighborhood to the south. For the urban village, the preferred height is 3 to 5 stories with opportunities for taller buildings up to 84 feet on major corridors. And it calls for preferred mixed use and residential uses. As far as the built form, the plan calls for focusing growth in areas where it's most appropriate or where surface parking and underutilized land, large parcels, and market interest is abundant. Again, the site is currently completely dominated by surface parking. It's 2 city lots worth with a building footprint of about 800 square feet, and the balance is surface parking. The plan talks about encouraging mixed use on Lake Street to connect Uptown and Lyndale. This is certainly a location where it's between 2 activity centers on Lake Street and is really filling in a gap in the urban fabric between those 2 activity centers. Established through design and use strong gradual transitions between residential and commercial areas. Again, here the applicant is doing that with the building design by concentrating the bulk on Lake Street. Also, the plan in itself builds in a transition space on the south side of this property. So the properties along Lake Street in this area are designated for commercial or mixed use. The area to the south of the site, immediately south, is actually designated for medium density, meaning that that would transition in the future to some sort of transition space in and of itself where you'd see, perhaps townhome development or something larger than what's there now. And then the south half of the block is designated as low density residential.
Kimberly, could you talk, maybe now is a good time, about what other uses would be allowed on the site, given the plan and the zoning context?
So the difference between the C3A district and the C2 district is primarily that the C2 district allows for a lot of auto-oriented uses that would not otherwise be allowed in C3A. Also, the size of commercial uses allowed in C2 is much larger than what's allowed in C3A. So C3A allows more kind of small scale neighborhood size uses, but the C2 district allows for uses up to 20,000 square feet as of right, and also allows for a lot of auto-oriented uses like your fast food establishments, auto repair uses. Here we have the pedestrian-oriented overlay district, so those uses would not be allowed in this instance, but generally between C2 and C3A, that's one of the big differences. Also, in the C3A district, nightclubs are allowed, but again, in this instance, they're not because there's a spacing requirement from residential uses that couldn't be met here.
Would an apartment building be allowed in C2?
An apartment building would be allowed in C2, yes. The height minimums or the height maximums as of right in C2 and C3 are the same. So it's 4 stories, 56 feet as of right in each district, and then anything beyond that is a conditional use permit. I'll skip through some of this stuff here about the urban village, but basically it's asking for, again, high density mixed use on the south side of Lake Street, maintaining strong, successful commercial areas, talking about having active uses at the ground floor, and transitioning in height as it turns the corner, approaching the existing neighborhood, which again, this building does. Land use recommendations. So the Uptown Small Area Plan talks about a lot of things, but it doesn't make a lot of specific land use recommendations. So here are 3 that apply to the site: discouraging 1-story commercial buildings, encouraging retail on Lake Street and Lagoon, and encouraging mixed use blocks along Lake Street with the goal of improving walkability and connectivity between Uptown and Lynn Lake. This here again is one more diagram out of the plan. So this is showing the land use intensity map, which is calling for urban oriented development on the site. On the bottom half of the page here, you're seeing the frontage types called for an urban oriented development. So the plan is looking for stoops, courtyards, parking that's screened from the street, patios or forecourts, and storefront type development. So this is a storefront development that has a little bit of space in front of it to allow for a forecourt. As far as building types, the plan is looking for, this is really tiny, live-work units, small apartments, courtyard buildings, mixed-use buildings, and loft-style buildings. So the only thing that doesn't fit with that urban-oriented development would be a building type that's parking podium with residential above or just straight parking. So the building type they're proposing here is consistent with that recommendation. So we also look at the surrounding uses on the site. I've touched on that a little bit. The area south of the site is primarily low-density residential. There is an 18-unit apartment building on this block and a couple of duplexes. On the west side of Emerson Avenue, there is a townhome development and then a block-long 2-story commercial building. Other uses just generally as you go towards the activity center, so to the north and west of the site, we see a lot of high-density mixed-use buildings, including a couple of newly approved developments that have not started construction yet. And then as you go east, it's more smaller scale commercial uses until you get down to the Lynn Lake Activity Center. So here's another look at the building. Another one of the applications before you today is a conditional use permit for height. I've talked a little bit about what the plan says about height. Basically, on this site, it's calling for, I'll get to that one. It's calling for a couple of different things in the plan. So one area in the plan, it says that additional height is allowed on key corridors, which Lake Street would be a key corridor, up to 84 feet. This building is less than 84 feet in height. And then elsewhere in the plan, there shows a built form diagram that shows a 4-story building as being recommended on the site. So we acknowledge here that, of course, the applicant is proposing 6 stories, not 4, but there are other policies in the plan that do not necessarily preclude the 4-story building here. So they are calling for density, for activity, and for mixed use on this site. We're also looking at this, so it says, as in the activity center, buildings 3 to 5 stories can provide transitions, and taller buildings may be appropriate on major corridors. So they're stepping down to 5 again as you go to the neighborhood. I think that's most obvious as you look in the rendering here. So there's an angled roof line on Lake Street that angles down and then steps down a full story as you go to the south. And again, really the impact of height on adjacent neighborhoods and on adjacent uses is primarily dictated by the way the bulk is distributed. So in this case, the bulk is distributed along Lake Street. We also look at shadowing impacts. In this case, the neighbors, the low density residential uses to the south are not impacted at all by shadowing because they're on the south side of the site. There's also very limited shadowing impacts on other commercial uses on Lake Street. The shadow barely reaches the opposite side of Lake Street and barely touches that sidewalk. It only impacts it in the late afternoon in the fall and spring. So here's just another look at those shadow studies. The applicant is providing a transition again on the south side of the site. So there's a 17-foot setback between the building footprint and the adjacent residential use, which is actually zoned OR1. We can also get a little bit more into the character of surrounding uses. Just looking at what's been approved up and down Lake Street since the site was put into its current zoning district. This site has been zoned commercial since 1924, and that's when the first zoning code was adopted, so presumably commercial uses were located on the site before that. Since the plan was put into the C2, or the site was put into the C2 district, and since the Uptown Small Area Plan was adopted, we've seen a lot of new development on Lake Street as you go from Hennepin to the east. So we've seen the walkway project, we've seen the project at the Cheapo site, there's a project at Emerson and Lagoon. All of those projects are 5 or 6 stories, one is 7, and they all have floor area ratios that are very similar to the floor area ratio proposed as part of this project. So that brings me to the next application here, which is the floor area ratio variance. The applicant is requesting to increase the floor area ratio from 2.7 to 3.78. We're finding that practical difficulties exist due to policy recommendations for dense mixed-use development on the site, and that the site is uniquely situated on a commercial corridor and near an activity center. Also, the trend in the area has been the recent trend in the area has been for similarly scaled development. So as we're looking at what's been approved, 1300 West Lake Street, which is the walkway project, was approved at a floor area ratio of 4.3. That was done in the last few years, and that is located outside of the activity center. The walkway is 3.67. 1300 West Lake Street is the Cheapo site. That was approved at 4.3 earlier this year outside of the activity center. There's a project at Lagoon and Emerson, which is approved at 3.77. That building is built, and that, again, is very close to what the applicant is requesting here, which is 3.78. The maximum achievable floor area ratio in the C3A district, if this property qualified for bonuses, is 3.78, which matches what they're asking for. In this case, because a hotel is considered a commercial use, it doesn't qualify for any bonuses. But, you know, similarly, the look of the building would be similar to if a residential development were to go in here and qualified for bonuses. The same thing could be achieved as of right at 3.78. The proposed FAR is in keeping with the spirit and intent of the ordinance and the comprehensive plan. The small area plan does not specifically reference building bulk, but calls for dense mixed-use development on the south side of Lake Street in the urban village. And again, the bulk is distributed on Lake Street to allow adequate access to light and air for adjacent properties. We have 2 yard variances. This froze on me. So the first yard variance, I'll stick with the original appeal from the neighbors, is for the rear yard, and that's along the alley. A variance to the rear yard from 15 feet to 0 is what's requested here. The 15-foot setback is only required because the applicant is putting windows on that side of the building. If there were not windows on that side of the building, it could be built up to the property line. So again, staff is finding that practical difficulties exist in complying with the ordinance for 2 reasons. One being that we want windows here. This isn't a pedestrian-oriented overlay district. Removing windows from that side of the building would diminish both the appearance of the building, but also SEPTED policies that call for additional eyes on the street and more visibility from the hotel onto the adjacent uses. Also, the setback requirement as it relates to windows is intended to somewhat reflect the building code requirements. So again, if there were no windows, it could be built up to the property line. The amount of openings proposed on that elevation are consistent and allowed by building code. There's an alley between the building and the adjacent use, which is another single-story commercial building. It's freezing on me. So that alley separation between this building and the building to the east allow for adequate separation between the uses. They allow for adequate access of light and air. The applicant is proposing to step the building back at the corner to allow a sight triangle as you're coming out of the alley to reduce any potential vehicle conflicts between vehicle traffic and pedestrian traffic on Lake Street. Staff did recommend denial of a variance to the front yard setback. That denial was upheld by the Planning Commission, so that's the concurrent appeal that we have today. The variance to the front yard setback is for a small portion of the building. So because the site to the south is zoned OR1, there's a setback requirement for the south 25 feet of the lot. So in that south 25 feet, the applicant is required to maintain a setback of 15 feet. So that setback is maintained for the south 20 feet of the lot, but there's a 5-foot portion of the building that encroaches into the required front yard. Staff did not find practical difficulties in complying with that regulation in the zoning code. There's a pretty consistent established pattern of setbacks along this side of Emerson. And also it would be a fairly minor adjustment in the building to bring that portion back and meet that 15-foot setback requirement. The final application that went to the Planning Commission was for, we have a loading variance. Sorry. That has also been appealed. So as far as the loading variance, staff found that practical difficulties exist. A loading will actually be accommodated on site without an official loading space. So the applicant has provided a narrative and some information in their travel demand management plan that shows laundry will be done on site to cut back on the number of deliveries for that use. Deliveries that come into the backside of the site will be accommodated via smaller vehicles that can fit on site, and anything larger would be accommodated on Lake Street, and they're working with Public Works on that. We also had a site plan review application that was not appealed. So that one is not before you. I will close there and can answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for staff? Okay, there are none. So we will open the public hearing. Why don't we begin with the applicant, then we'll have the other appellant. There are two appeals, so it gets a little confusing, but we'll start with the applicant, then we'll have the folks who appealed, and then we'll open it up for everyone else to have 2 minutes each. And then we'll ask all of our speakers to please sign in with the clerk, and please state your name and address for the record before you speak.
I'm Benjamin Graves with Graves Hospitality. My father and I have been working on trying to do a hotel in Uptown for at least 8 years now. We were originally working with Stu Ackerberg on the original Mosaic project that got stalled out because of the economy and things like that. But we live near the neighborhood. Jim's moving into the neighborhood, and we've always wanted to do a hotel. We've had a lot of outreach on that. We're very excited about this site and about this opportunity, and thank you for your time today. I'll keep it very brief. You guys can ask whatever questions you like, but I did want to bring up the side yard setback and explain some of our reasonings for why we would still propose that we are able to build that sliver piece of the building. I do have up on the screen. You can see the white checked area. It's 5 feet by 7 feet. That's the area that we're encroaching on that side yard setback. That puts the reason that we are even talking about this side yard setback or the need for this setback is due to the process that we went through with not because of the city's request, but because of the neighborhood's requests. We did meet many meetings with neighbors, individual, one-on-one, at neighborhood at neighborhood board, neighborhood association meetings, and because of that, we want to really be proud of what we're doing here. We want the neighborhood to be proud and embrace this project that's going to be an asset for Uptown. And the neighborhood really didn't like the height, and they wanted us to step the building down. And so we ended up redesigning the building as a U shape. And one of the other reasons that we changed to the U shape was to face the windows into the courtyard and not facing the neighbors, because some of the neighbors didn't want us overlooking their backyards. Understandable. We were able to come up with a design that we think was very appropriate, but due to that design, to meet the requirements of how the stairwells work in the building and everything, we're encroaching 5 feet by 7 feet on that setback. We could take that portion of the building and push it to the backside. We do have more room behind there, but that would be encroaching in the neighborhood further. And we don't really want to do that. And we feel that this is a very appropriate design, and that there is a bit of a hardship due to the trying to work with everyone on getting something that we're all proud of.
Just so we can understand, could you just walk through the picture and point to the area that's, you have it marked, but just so that we can all see. Yeah,
let me grab a pen
clearly
here. So
what
the outline of the building is right here. This dash line right here. It's like a U. And this little portion right here, which is 5 feet by 7 feet, is where we're encroaching. If you looked at the adjacent property, their building is actually much encroaching into the neighborhood further at the property line. We did go out and take a measurement of that to confirm that. And so we think it's very much in fitting with the commercial building that is next door to us. But in addition, we could take that as of right, or not, I don't know if it's as of right, but within the setback requirements, we could build in this blue section here, which we're not. We're pulling the building back further, and this is the area that we're requesting a variance on that side yard setback. So it's 5 feet by 7 feet, and what that does is it would alleviate this kind of weird niche in the building from an aesthetic perspective to the neighborhood. And then our windows, of course, for the guest rooms face out this way and this way. So we're not. We do have windows on the side of the building, but they're at a higher area. They're not viewing windows. And so we worked with the neighborhood to make sure that we didn't have people looking down into people's backyards.
Okay. Any questions?
And that's all I have.
Thank you. Can you remind us the height of the original proposal?
We were originally proposing a 9-story building. I don't remember the actual height of it, but it was 84 feet.
Okay. Thank you. And what's this height?
This height is
56.
72.5 at the peak, and then it steps down.
Thank you. Okay. There are no questions for the applicant, so we will move. Mr. Qualley, would you like to present first, or we could also open the hearing either way?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm Tom Johnson with the Gray Plant Moody Law Firm, and I'm representing the appellants. I came prepared today to speak about the rezoning and why that rezoning is inconsistent with the Uptown Small Area Plan, inconsistent, contrary to the Minneapolis Plan and the criteria under the ordinance for granting a rezoning. That's intertwined with why the conditional use permit should be denied. And I would like to get into that. But let me tell you first what we learned yesterday, which is that the parking, which staff indicated is going to be provided primarily through valet services, was apparently to be accommodated in the Calhoun Square ramp. Well, I learned yesterday from the owner of that ramp that there isn't any space available in the Calhoun Square ramp. And so that can't be accommodated. There have been, I learned from the owner, who also owns the Mosaic building, that there's been some discussion about parking at Mosaic. But there is no signed agreement. The owner doesn't know whether there's even space available in terms of the number of spaces that would be needed to be provided to meet the minimum ordinance requirement on a 24/7 basis. And that wasn't analyzed in the staff report. That they look at the Calhoun Square ramp, and is that within 800 feet, and does that meet all the other ordinance requirements, et cetera. That's a big deal. There is no parking currently provided for this hotel. And it seems to me that should stop the committee and council in its tracks and say, well, wait a second. We can't move forward with the rezoning. We can't move forward with approving all these variances until we know that you have parking available. That should be step number one in this analysis here.
So as I stated earlier, as we opened this item, we did have the public hearing for the rezoning at the Planning Commission. Right. To your point, so this is a quasi-judicial proceeding related to the appeals. To your point, the rezoning is part of the whole package. So as the chair, I will allow some comments about the rezoning, but I just want to state the legal context, which is that public hearing has been opened and closed at Planning Commission.
Okay. Appreciate that.
And that is also for the folks who came to speak. I know people will likely speak about the rezoning, but again, the focus of today is on the appeals for the conditional use permit and the variances.
Well, I think at the heart of this matter is whether the small area plan and therefore the comprehensive plan accommodate a hotel at this site. And when you look to see whether there's an accommodation, you don't look at the general policy and platitudes within the Minneapolis plan. That there's policies there that will support just about anything. And there's some broad language even in the small area plan. What you do look at is the specific language. And since this site is not in the activity center where hotels are allowed, this is not a question about whether you could have a hotel in Uptown. Hotels are permitted in the activity center. They wouldn't be here for any reason if they were in the activity center. They'd be going for a building permit, not for a zoning change, a conditional use permit, and 4 variances, which says a lot about the size of the site in relationship to what's being built. So when you look at the small area plan and what it says, there clearly was intended to be a breakpoint at Lake Street. North of Lake Street, high-intensity development. This is outside of the activity center I'm talking about now. This is in what's called the urban village area, south sub-area. Lake Street, south of that was where the transition was going to occur into the residential neighborhood. And if you take a look, there's references to that fact throughout the small area plan. And I'll just read you one. This is page 56. Restaurants are permitted in the urban village, south sub-area. That's where the proposed hotel site is located. But other evening uses, such as nightclubs and hotels, should be located in the activity center. Now, you can't be much more specific than that. The activity center says that's where hotels are located. And then it says south of Lake Street, there shouldn't be any hotels of this size. So hard for me to imagine how you could be in more conflict with the small area plan when